Disney's upcoming Snow White movie is looking like the biggest dumpster fire to come out of the company so far. Rachel Zegler, the actress playing Snow White, is actually proud of her hatred for the character and the story, calling the prince of the story a stalker, saying that she thought it was too scary and that she's maybe seen it twice across her entire life.
Her love story with a guy who literally stalks her. Weird.
However, this wasn't just a one-off. Nearly every decision Disney's made towards this movie has announced the same type of stupidity. For example, instead of 7 dwarfs, Snow White is going to meet 7 diverse magical creatures. The prince will be cut altogether, and the story won't revolve around love at all. Instead, Snow White's going to pursue her dreams of becoming a leader, a girl boss, and seizing power for herself. So how did it come to this? Snow White is an essential part of Disney. It was the movie that started it all. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that this film was the backbone of hundreds of millions of childhoods. The money from the movie literally built Disney's first studio. So how are Disney going to treat the most sacred and beloved work of art? Well, let's take a look. So one of the most famous love stories, up there with Romeo and Juliet in its cultural significance, is going to be about girl boss attitudes instead. I mean, it's an insult to even call this movie Snow White. The movie seems like a parody of modern Disney, but it's genuinely just the standard for them now, as for years, they've been pumping out flop after flop, sequels and remakes that all tell the same story by hijacking people's childhood classics. A few of the more recent ones are The Little Mermaid, Peter Pan, Wendy, Pinocchio, Mulan, Aladdin, The Lion King, the list just goes on, and there's a bunch of similarities between all of these movies. They all got middling to poor reviews, and they all barely broke even or just flat out lost money. Even the critics couldn't justify them, and audiences definitely weren't interested in these movies. But more importantly though, they were all completely unnecessary, and there's a few good reasons for all of these failures, and a huge reason as to why Snow White is going to fail at the box office. And the most obvious one is that nobody wanted these movies to begin with. The originals are classics, made with love and care for the fairy tales or stories they're telling. Over decades and decades of history, they all rose to the top and kept their place in culture because of this. So trying to remake them immediately puts you in competition with some of the best movies ever made, which is ridiculous when you take a look at what the remakes bring to the table. They're just bad films, plain and simple. They have some good qualities of course, and it's hard to generalize. The visual effects are often stunning, and the actors try their best with what they're given. But with few exceptions, all these films have absolutely awful writing. The way they treat their characters is almost childlike in its simplicity. The heroines of these movies aren't flawed or interesting at all. Instead, it's the world that gets forced to change around them. Mulan's a perfect example of this. In the original, Mulan is no different from anyone else from the outside. She struggles at first, but overcomes her obstacles through hard work, perseverance, and the strength of her will. In the remake though, Mulan is given superpowers instead. Only they're not really superpowers, instead they're explained through a bastardization of the Chinese idea of qi. The end result is a character that doesn't change or grow because she's already finished her arc before she's even started. And a final irony of the Mulan film is that while it sold itself under the buzzword of diversity, it was one of the most exploitative films in modern history. I mean, most of the filming took place in the Chinese province of Xinjiang, the same province where China is imprisoning and torturing millions of its minority peoples in re-education camps, with the movie even giving credits and thanks to the local Chinese government, including the specific department responsible for these re-education camps, or in more plain words, concentration camps. Mulan's a result of the standard heroine template that Disney uses in all of their modern movies. Without flaws or growth, these characters are just boring and unlikable. Instead, they've been designed to fit a set of traits and qualities which the corporations have decided are what makes a strong female character, a girl boss, and they're always the most powerful character in the story, to the point where the conflict loses all of its momentum. Watching Captain Marvel feels like an episode of One Punch Man, without any of the good bits, just waiting for her to finally and effortlessly win. They'll also magically gain whatever ability they need to continue the plot, like in the newer Star Wars movies when Rey gets her new healing powers or her sudden mastery of lightsaber fights. They never earn this power, but once they get it, they immediately know what to do and how to use it. At the end of the movie, they haven't learned anything about themselves actually related to their struggles and their journey. Instead, it's the world that changes and realizes their superiority, like She-Hulk, who's almost immediately in full control of her powers. She effortlessly integrates into her identity. It took Bruce Banner a movie, a multi-film character arc, and a whole cinematic universe to get to that stage. But a final part of the strong female character template is that they're always obsessed with their own power and leadership. Of course, it's great to teach little girls that they can rule the world, but now that's seemingly the only thing women can be anymore if they want to be feminist and acceptable by modern standards. In effect, we've traded one closed-off box to put female characters in for another one. Women don't have to only be housewives and princesses, but they don't have to be leaders either. Feminism means the freedom for women to be whatever they choose to be, framing the desire for love, having children, and a happy family as a patriarchal indoctrination has the same silencing and dehumanizing effect as any other constraint society puts on women. But that's exactly what Snow White will be about, and if Rachel Zegler's interviews on the film are to be believed, Snow White won't be falling for a prince or even thinking about love or other people at all.
I just mean that it's no longer 1937, and we absolutely wrote a Snow White that is
not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be saved by the prince, and she's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be.
Instead, she reduced the prince's role in the story to being a stalker. Inevitably, his only role in the remake will be as a laughable example of a pathetic weak man who Snow White pushes aside to pursue what's really important. Or he's just cut out entirely, never even mentioned, and never in the film to begin with. I mean, in the original, he's an essential part of the story. The movie's arcs around this, but Disney's already shown their own disregard for the source material. It isn't surprising that Zegler's barely seen the film, but it begs the question, if she hates the fairy tale and the original so much, why is she even starring in Snow White in the first place? Well, of course we all know the real reason for this. It's the same reason Disney's making the film in the first place. By pandering to this caricature of feminism, they're hoping they can cover up the bad writing and the many flaws in the premise itself, that the politically correct masses will gobble it up and use it as an example of what modern women should aspire to be. But all the virtue signaling in the world can't cover up the fact that barely anyone even wants this. The movie is written and directed by a man. The audience is a mix of men and women, and at the end of the day, Disney has nothing to do with feminism at all. And you see, the thing is, Disney's audience don't want this corporate brand of half-baked pseudo-feminism that Disney's trying to sell down everyone's throats. I mean, when you compare Disney's many failed attempts at this compared to the Barbie movie, it becomes crystal clear at what people really want to see. The movie's just setting itself up to be just one more in a long line of overly sanitized Disney flops. And defenders of Disney's approach might put the onus on the audience, calling out critics of their films for being anti-inclusive or simply not respecting stories told from the female perspective. However, Barbie's success is evidence that this notion is simply not true at all. It's blown away every recent live-action Disney project out of the water, and is currently on track to become one of the highest grossing films of all time, showing us that films that are inclusive aren't always complete flops, but woke, virtue signaling, boring, empty movies are hated universally in the public. And yet for years, Disney has continuously pumped out these sorts of movies, producing flop after flop, sequels and remakes that all tell the same story, hijacking everyone's childhood classics. Barbie has smashed countless box office records, and has already grossed over $1 billion worldwide, making it clear that the world does have some capacity to respond well to some female-driven narratives when the script is written well, and its creators have respect for the source material while at the same time not taking themselves too seriously. Because you see, Disney isn't just failing because the movies are about women, it's because they're terribly written, virtue-signaling films given the same constant goal boss narrative that's as stale as it can come. Whereas Barbie is the perfect example of a blockbuster feminist story that can be universally related to. It's enjoyed because its message and main character, despite being in Barbie land, are very much somehow grounded in reality. Margot Robbie's Barbie isn't an exceptional leader or an especially gifted or talented individual. She's one of many Barbies in her little world, with most of these other Barbies being more tangibly impressive, having more specialized skills than Margot Robbie does. And when she's met with unexpected conflict, she's just as ill prepared as many a person would be. The odds seem instantly stacked against her, and she quickly becomes a fish out of the water. And the uphill nature of Barbie's struggle and her changing throughout the movie as a result of what she's experiencing is what makes it a compelling story. And despite her flawless appearance at the start of the movie, we quickly find out that she's just as flawed and vulnerable as everyone else is. And yet Disney's female-driven blockbusters seem averse to writing their protagonists this way, out of fear that they will be criticized as anti-feminist. However, it's clear that when you take a look at male-driven movies, just how flawed this logic truly is. Not every male protagonist is John McClane, James Bond, or Sherlock Holmes. Sometimes the most compelling protagonists aren't these great men we dream to be. Sometimes they're the characters who are regular, seemingly unspecial people, who when faced with conflict become great, going through a hero's journey. So not every female character needs to be a beacon of unwavering ruthlessness or bravery to be interesting or feminist. They just have to be someone a woman watching can see themselves in. And the other key element to Barbie's success is its creativity. The movie is uniquely designed, the cinematography draws you in, the set designs and creativity is engaging for all audiences. And the movie, while being far from perfect with a very questionable narrative, is still entertaining to almost everyone. There's a reason it grossed over $1 billion at the box box office, because the Barbie movie took some needed risks. The jokes are surprising, the existential themes are at the forefront of the movie, and the filmmakers are unafraid to make a viewer uncomfortable at times. However, when you take a look at Disney's recent movies, they're so unwilling to take any risks, so scared to accidentally offend any particular group, that the movies end up saying nothing, and in turn, they appeal to no one. The stories are just completely sanitized and full of virtue signaling. Women don't identify with them, and men of course never want to see these movies. And perhaps the strangest part is that the box office numbers reflect all of this, with nearly all of their live action remakes raking in just a fraction of what they could have, considering the A-list cast and the popularity of the IPs. So when will Disney finally learn from this? Not this time apparently. A lot of the outrage around Snow White has been about their choices surrounding the 7 dwarfs. It's really just a lose-lose scenario, and yet another reason they shouldn't even make this film in the first place. You see, in the original story, they're a collection of name stereotypes, while also being dwarves on top of that. They laid the groundwork for decades of stupid jokes and prejudice, so it's inevitable that they be changed in some way, but Disney's original plan seems to have been to keep them pretty much the same. An earlier remake called Snow White and the Huntsman kept them as dwarfs, but didn't actually hire any dwarf actors and just superimposed other actors' faces onto smaller bodies. However, Disney were quick to change their tune when Peter Dinklage made a statement rightfully calling them out as backwards, as it's ridiculous to preach diversity because you've hired a Latino actor for the main part, and yet you keep the disabled stereotypes in the film. So they did a 180, turning the dwarfs into nondescript magical creatures, only one of which is actually a dwarf now, which obviously isn't a good decision either. Cutting out the dwarfs may avoid the stereotype accusations, but it's all so far removed from the actual fairy tale that it's barely even Snow White anymore. With no prince, only one dwarf and a power-hungry Snow White, unconcerned with any true love, hating men and the patriarchy, it's a wonder why they're sticking with the name and not just making an entirely new film. The decision also means that Disney will be hiring way less dwarf actors, who already have trouble finding work that isn't demeaning. This all comes at the same time as Hugh Grant playing the role of an Oompa Loompa in another Charlie and the Chocolate Factory remake. At the end of the day though, they could have cast real dwarfs in the movie, as long as they actually had good writing. If they humanized the characters rather than using them as pawns in a game of identity politics, it could work. But knowing what we know about the rest of the movie, this will never happen. And we can't forget that this is all a publicity stunt for Disney anyway. They don't care about actually representing minority communities or standing up against prejudice. If they did, they wouldn't censor their own movies when they're trying to sell them to more repressive countries. One scene from Avengers Endgame, where a man just talks about going on a date with another man, was entirely cut from the Russian release. The same thing happened in the Disney Pixar film Onward, when it released in 2020. A same-sex kiss scene was edited out of Marvel's Eternals for some Middle Eastern countries, and China's probably one of the most demanding countries for censorship, and Disney's very happy to play along. A huge amount of their movies would have been even bigger flops if it weren't for the Chinese market. They changed the Tibetan character to our white one for Doctor Strange, all so that they could secure a Chinese release. A Simpsons episode that included a joke about Tiananmen Square mysteriously disappeared from Hong Kong's Disney Plus, because Disney only cares about the money, killing all of their ability to make good movies and inspire creativity. So maybe after the Snow White failure, they'll finally learn, but probably not.